April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War is over. Slavery in America is dead. Or at least, that's what they taught you in school. The truth is far darker. The truth is that slavery didn't die in 1865. It just changed its name. Within months of Lee's surrender, a new system emerged across the South, a system that would re-enslave hundreds of thousands of black Americans, a system built on a single loophole in the Constitution, and a system that would generate fortunes for private companies while turning prisons into death camps. This is the story of convict leasing, and it's a story that most Americans have never heard. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on December 6, 1865, 8 months after the war ended. The amendment's language seemed clear and absolute. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But there was a clause, a single exception, that would undo everything. The amendment read, "Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." That exception, those 13 words, became the foundation for one of the most brutal labor systems in American history. Southern states understood immediately what this meant. If you could convict someone of a crime, you could legally enslave them. And so, starting in late 1865, state after state across the South began passing what became known as black codes. These weren't subtle. Mississippi passed the first one in November 1865, just weeks after the war ended. The law required all black people to present written proof of employment every January. No job, no proof. You were arrested for vagrancy. In South Carolina, black people couldn't work as anything except farmers or servants unless they paid an annual tax of between $10 and $100. That's roughly $2,000 to $2,000 today. Most formerly enslaved people had nothing. They couldn't pay, so they were arrested. Florida made it illegal for black people to be out after sunset without permission. Louisiana required black workers to sign year-long labor contracts with white employers. If you quit before the year was up, you forfeited all wages, and you were arrested. In Texas, black children whose parents were deemed unable to support them could be forced into unpaid apprenticeships, often with their former enslavers. Georgia made it a crime for black people to own guns, to testify in court against white people, or to marry white people. Violation meant prison. But the real genius, if you can call it that, of the black codes was the vagrancy laws. These laws were everywhere, and they were incredibly vague. Vagrancy could mean being unemployed. It could mean not having a permanent home. It could mean loitering. It could mean rambling without a job. One Virginia law from 1866 said that anyone who appeared unemployed or homeless could be arrested and forced to work for up to 3 months. If they ran away, they'd be recaptured, chained, and forced to work without pay for the rest of their term. The penalties for vagrancy were brutal. Fines of $25, $50, sometimes $100. Amounts that poor black people had no way of paying. And when you couldn't pay the fine, the judge would sentence you to hard labor, and that's when the leasing system kicked in. Here's how it worked. State and county governments found themselves with a sudden problem in 1865 and 1866. Their prisons, if they still existed after the war, were overflowing with newly convicted black prisoners. Feeding them, housing them, guarding them, it all cost money. Money that Southern states didn't have after losing the war. But then someone had an idea. What if, instead of the state paying to keep prisoners, private companies paid the state to rent them? The prisoners would work for the company. The company would house them, feed them, and guard them. The state would get cash, and the prisoners would get nothing. This was convict leasing. By the 1870s, it was operating across the South. Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia. Every former Confederate state embraced it, and the numbers exploded. In Tennessee, black people made up 33% of the prison population in October 1865. By November 1867, they were 58%. In Georgia, the state began leasing convicts in 1868. Before the war, most prisoners had been white. Within 5 years, black prisoners outnumbered white prisoners by massive margins. The companies that leased convicts came from every major industry: coal mines, iron foundries, turpentine camps, lumber companies, railroad construction, brick factories, cotton plantations, sugar plantations, phosphate mines, and the terms were absurdly cheap. In Alabama, companies could lease a convict for as little as $9 a month. That's roughly $180 today, less than what you'd pay for a gym membership for a full-time laborer who couldn't quit, who couldn't strike, who couldn't demand better wages or safer conditions, and who, if they tried to escape, would be hunted down and beaten. The work was backbreaking. In coal mines, convicts descended into shafts hundreds of feet below ground. The air was thick with coal dust. The ceilings were low. Cave-ins were common. In Alabama's Pratt Coal and Iron Company mines, convicts worked from 3 in the morning until 8 at night. 17 hours a day, 6 days a week. They hacked at coal seams with pickaxes in near total darkness, lit only by dim oil lamps. They hauled heavy carts full of coal through narrow tunnels. They breathed in toxic gas, methane, carbon monoxide. Black lung disease was rampant, and the companies didn't care because if a convict died, the state would just send another one. In turpentine camps, convicts worked in swamps. They cut into pine trees to extract resin. They stood knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in stagnant water, filled with mosquitoes, snakes, and disease. Malaria was everywhere, so was dysentery, so was tuberculosis. The camps had no doctors, no medical care. If you got sick, you either recovered on your own or you died. In railroad construction, convicts laid track across brutal terrain. They hauled steel rails that weighed hundreds of pounds. They drove spikes into wooden ties with sledgehammers. They worked in a 100-degree heat in the summer and freezing rain in the winter. And they were punished if they didn't work fast enough. Punishment was constant and savage. Whipping was the most common method. Convicts were stripped and tied to posts or laid flat on the ground. Then they were beaten with leather straps, sometimes reinforced with metal, 20 lashes, 50 lashes, in some cases over 100 lashes. The skin on their backs would split open, blood poured out, scars formed, permanent scars that marked them for life. But whipping wasn't the only method. There was something called the sweat box, a small wooden box barely big enough to stand in, painted black. Convicts who broke rules were locked inside in the middle of summer. The temperature inside could reach 130 degrees. Men passed out. Some never woke up. There was the water cure, a form of torture where water was forced down a convict's throat until their stomach distended. Then guards would stomp on the stomach. In Georgia, there was a device called the bucking machine. Convicts were strapped to a log and beaten until they couldn't stand. And there were chains, shackles around ankles, shackles around wrists, heavy iron balls attached to legs, Men worked in chains. They slept in chains. They ate in chains. Some wore chains for months without them ever being removed. The death rates were staggering. In Alabama, approximately 25% of leased black convicts died in 1873, 1 in 4, in a single year. In Mississippi, annual mortality rates for leased convicts ranged from 9 to 16% in the 1880s. Historian David Oshinsky noted that not a single convict in Mississippi lived long enough to serve out a sentence of 10 or more years. They all died. In 1879, just 4 years after Alabama began leasing convicts, 40% of all prisoners had died in custody. 40%. And this wasn't an accident. It was a feature of the system, not a bug. Companies had very little financial investment in leased convicts. Unlike enslaved people before the war who could be sold and had tangible economic value, leased convicts cost almost nothing. If a convict died, the company just leased another one. There was no incentive to keep them alive, no incentive to feed them well, no incentive to provide medical care, no incentive to ensure safe working conditions. Death rates under convict leasing were roughly 10 times higher than death rates in non-leasing states. 10 times. An 1881 report on Virginia's convict lease system found that the death rate in railroad convict camps was 7 times higher than the death rate inside the state. Penitentiary. In Jefferson County, Alabama, the Coalburg mine had a death rate of 90 men per 1,000 prisoners in 1895. That's 9%. In a single year, at a single mine. In Alabama's mines overall, 233 state prisoners died between 1894 and 1896, out of 1,710 men, and conditions for county prisoners were even worse. 181 county prisoners died in those same 2 years out of a population of only 745. The causes of death were predictable: rockfalls in mines, explosions, electrocutions, heat stroke, exhaustion, pneumonia, tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, infected wounds from whippings, starvation. One report from the time described convicts at the Pratt mines in Alabama as huddled together in foul accommodations where the water was impure, the meat consisted primarily of fat, and pneumonia, typhoid, and diarrhea were prevalent. The conditions at the Sloss mines, also in Alabama, were described as even worse. The health of the convicts was very bad and the mortality great. But the profits were massive. This is the part that makes the system truly evil. Convict leasing generated enormous wealth for private companies and for state governments. In Alabama, convict leasing accounted for about 10% of total state revenue in 1883. By 1898, it had surged to nearly 73%. Nearly 3/4 of the state's entire budget came from renting out human beings. In Louisiana, the revenue from leasing was so high that the state abolished property taxes for a time. In Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Florida, convict leasing became one of the largest sources of state income. For the companies, the profits were even more staggering. Take the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, known as TCI. TCI was one of the largest users of convict labor in the South. At its peak, the company operated coal mines, iron foundries, and coke ovens across Tennessee and Alabama. It leased hundreds, sometimes thousands of convicts at a time. These men worked in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. They mined coal. They operated massive blast furnaces. They manned fiery coke ovens, dome-shaped structures where coal was baked at extreme temperatures to produce coke for steelmaking. The heat was unbearable. Men collapsed regularly. Burns were common. Death was routine. The Lone Rock Stockade in Tracy City, Tennessee, was one of TCI's most notorious facilities. Built to hold 200 men, it sometimes held 600. The prisoners slept in cramped, unsanitary barracks. They worked 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days. They breathed coal dust and toxic fumes, and they died in droves. At the Tracy City mine, men were arrested for the smallest offenses: stealing a hog, having an interracial relationship, which was punishable by up to 5 years of hard labor in Tennessee, being unemployed. And once convicted, they were leased to TCI and sent to the Lone Rock Stockade. In 1907, the United States Steel Corporation, the largest corporation in the world at the time, acquired TCI, and the brutality continued. In 1908, the first full year of U.S. Steel's ownership, almost 60 convict workers died from workplace-related accidents in Alabama alone. 60 men in 1 year. U.S. Steel also discovered a 400% annual turnover rate in its workforce. People were dying or being replaced at an astonishing pace, and yet the company kept leasing convicts because it was profitable. Over the next 5 years, more than 100 men died in U.S. Steel's Alabama mining operations. The company has never fully acknowledged this history. But convict leasing wasn't just about coal and iron. It was everywhere. In Florida, convict labor was used extensively in turpentine camps and lumber operations. Men were sent deep into swamps to extract pine resin. They worked in water. They lived in shanties. They were beaten if they didn't meet quotas. The Putnam Lumber Company in Clara, Florida, was one of the most notorious. In 1922, a young white man named Martin Tabbert was arrested in Tallahassee for riding a train without paying the 80-cent fare. He was convicted of vagrancy and fined $25. His parents sent $25 for the fine and another $25 for him to get home to North Dakota, but the money disappeared. Instead, Tabbert was leased to Putnam Lumber. He was sent to a labor camp 60 miles south of Tallahassee. At the camp, Tabbert was forced to lay railroad track. He developed a fever. His feet swelled. He couldn't keep up with the work. So the camp's whipping boss, a man named Thomas Walter Higginbotham, tied him to a post and beat him with a 7.5-pound leather strap. Tabbert died shortly after. The company told his family he died of fever. But that wasn't the truth. Another prisoner managed to contact the Tabbert family and told them what really happened. Their son had been tortured to death. The Tabberts filed a lawsuit. The case made national news. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the brutality of Florida's convict leasing system. There were headlines like, "Tragedy of North Dakota Farm Boy Who Was Beaten to Death in Florida Peonage Camp." The outrage was widespread. The New York World newspaper published an expose on Tabbert's death in 1924 and won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. The coverage was so intense that Florida finally abolished convict leasing in 1923. But the damage had been done, and in other states, the system continued for years. Georgia abolished convict leasing in 1908 after similar scandals, but it replaced the system with chain gangs, where prisoners were shackled together and forced to work on public roads. The conditions were still brutal, just managed by the state instead of private companies. Alabama held out the longest. The state didn't officially end convict leasing until July 1st, 1928. For more than 60 years, Alabama had profited from renting out human beings. And even after convict leasing officially ended, the legacy continued. Chain gangs persisted across the South well into the 20th century. Prisoners were still forced to work on roads and quarries and on state farms. They were still beaten. They were still chained. They were still treated as less than human. Convict leasing may have ended in name, But forced prison labor never went away, and the 13th Amendment still allows it. To this day, prisoners in the United States can be forced to work for little or no pay. Some work in fields, some make products, some fight wildfires. The language in the Constitution hasn't changed, except as a punishment for crime. That loophole is still there. So why don't we talk about this more? Why isn't convict leasing taught in schools alongside slavery and Reconstruction? Why don't more people know that slavery continued in all but name for another 80 years after the Civil War ended? Part of it is uncomfortable history. It's easier to teach that slavery ended in 1865 and leave it at that. But the truth is messier and darker, and it forces us to reckon with the fact that American capitalism, American infrastructure, and American wealth were built in large part on the backs of people who were enslaved under a different name. The railroads that crisscrossed the South, the coal that powered industrialization, the steel that built cities. Much of it was extracted and produced by men who had no freedom, no rights, and no future. Convict leasing was not a footnote. It was not an aberration. It was a deliberate, systematic effort to maintain white supremacy and economic control after the South lost the war. It was slavery rebranded, and the people who profited from it, state governments, private companies, wealthy industrialists, knew exactly what they were doing. They exploited a loophole in the Constitution. They arrested black men in massive numbers for offenses that didn't exist before emancipation. They worked them to death in mines, camps, and fields, and they made fortunes while doing it. The system was designed to extract labor, and it extracted lives. Today, the descendants of those who survived convict leasing are still fighting for recognition, still fighting for acknowledgement of what was done, and still fighting to change the laws that allow forced prison labor to continue, because the 13th Amendment hasn't been amended. The exception is still there, and as long as it exists, the possibility for abuse remains. This is the history they didn't teach you. This is the story of convict leasing. Slavery didn't end in 1865. It just changed its name. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.